Hi, this is Luke Johnson from the Humanities Teaching app Noetic, and tonight we will be having a roundtable with Jordan Klein,
Greetings.
Lindsay O'Connor, CJ Eller, and of course myself, since I'm a talking thing. And we will be doing the second installment of Jacques Derrida's Structure, Sign, and Play. So, I don't know. I had some time to think about and review the tape from last week. We picked an interesting piece to explore. I think, now this is my opinion, and Lindsay is someone who is more versed with Derrida, but part of the trouble with working with this essay is it seems like to me that there's a great deal of assumption of knowledge of the audience. From what I understand, this was a lecture that was given at Johns Hopkins, and supposedly everyone in that audience would be familiar with the work of Foucault and Levi-Strauss and Saussure. Is that how I say his name?
Saussure.
Saussure. Is that how I say his name? And if you don't have those definitions defined for you up front, if you're not in the in crowd, I could see, doing like what I did, fumbling through the entire essay. I think we made like good progress fighting through it, but there were a lot of errors personally that I felt like I committed. So I don't know. I feel like it was kind of a weird essay to choose in that respect. But I don't. And for that reason, I decided to do a little bit of research to help orient and frame our conversation. So I want to get into that. But does anyone else have any sort of introductory preface remarks on this back half of the Derrida essay?
I guess I'll toss out there.
Please do.
I hear you about. It's this whole long thing about Levi-Strauss and who is that. If you're a philosopher, if you're a literary person, you don't necessarily know anything about him and what his deal is. And that makes a lot of sense. But I mean, it seems worth pointing out that like much criticism and much philosophy works that way. That it does not everything starts from the very beginning, and so having to figure out some terms and sort of enter into a conversation that you haven't been around for all the time. You got to start somewhere, So I kind of wanted to defend Derrida for that.
Sure.
But I also, it's a little hard for me to get out of it, I think, because I've read this essay a number of times, and I think it has opened up to me a little bit more each time I've read it. Which is not to say that I fully and comprehensively understand it and it has no mysteries. So it's just hard for me to go back to reading it for the first time, I think, and like being in that position of like what is going on. So with that caveat, I want to consider that maybe there's enough here, or there is stuff here in this essay that can help us figure out what's going on, right? Extensive quotation, right, of Levi-Strauss, right? So like we do get Levi-Strauss doing what he does and Derrida glossing him and explaining like the parts, telling us how he wants us to see, like what parts he wants us to take from Levi-Strauss, right? And I do think that he explains in the course of the essay, to me, it does become clear what words like structure and what center mean. That if you spend time with this paper, those things can kind of become clear, which is not to say that like the research you've done is not needed, right? But I guess I don't want to say that this piece is, so precise and specific and for a particular audience that you need to have all of this background in order to get into it, because I stand by the idea that this is a pretty good introduction to Derrida, which says a lot about Derrida, right? That he's very difficult. Like if this is a good introduction, then you're like, whoa, what else is there, right? And I think there are other things we could have done, like we could have read Difference, maybe, there's a few other things, but I think that there are the terms here become clear, I think, as the essay goes on. I think if you start on the first page as y'all were doing and you're like, okay, there's this concept of structure, and you're like, I don't know what that is, right? That maybe keeping going is actually the thing to do, which I know is really weird because you're like, I don't know what these words mean. How am I supposed to keep going, right? But it seems like that it rewards more attention. So there's an
emergent quality. It was interesting. I saw this little response between an interviewer and Faulkner not too long ago, and the interviewer said to Faulkner, I've read your books 2 and 3 times and I still don't understand them. What do you recommend that I do? And he said, read them a 4th time. And the thing is, what we've done with this text is that we probably needed to read it at least 2 times. I think that was the magic sort of happens where things you're able to comprehend things a lot better.
On the Faulkner point, though, there was some time that somebody asked him, pointed to some line or whatever that he'd written, and he was like, I have no idea what you mean here. Do you know what you meant? And he was like, hell if I know. I was real corned up when I wrote that. So,
What about CJ and Jordan? What would you guys like to say before we get into tonight's discussion? Yeah.
Hopefully.
That kind of says it all, right? Like, it's a stupefying text in a lot of ways. Well, can I proceed with some explanatory information here?
Please.
So one of the big things, it's not obvious to me, and because I've only read it through one time all the way through. I do and I do not understand what some of these elementary concepts that are involved in Derrida, like what structure is, what elements are, what free play, and all that stuff. I think we will have a better grasp of those things as the evening proceeds. But I wanted to give us a little bit of background here because I've never studied structuralism before. And to just get us grounded, I went to the University of Alabama's anthropology department website. I thought it was really helpful. A professor and a number of his graduate students put together a pretty comprehensive encyclopedia for people just getting into the study of anthropology. And Rachel Briggs and Janelle Meyer had this to say. I'm going to just lift this straight from the website, and you guys should all check it out. It's a really great resource. So on the basic premises of structuralism, structuralism was predominantly influenced by the schools of phenomenology and of Gestalt psychology, both of which were fostered in Germany between 1910 and the 1930s. Phenomenology was a school of philosophical thought that attempted to give philosophy a rational, scientific basis. Principally, it was concerned with accurately describing consciousness and abolishing the gulf that had traditionally existed between subject and object of human thought. Consciousness, as they perceived, was always conscious of something, and that picture, that whole, cannot be separated from the object or the subject, but is a relationship between them. Phenomenology was made manifest in the works of Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, and Jean-Paul Sartre, among others. Gestalt psychology maintained that all human conscious experience is pattern, emphasizing that the whole is always greater than the parts, making it a holistic view. It fosters a view that the human mind functions by recognizing, or if none are available, imposing structures. Structuralism developed as a theoretical framework in linguistics by Ferdinand de Saussure in the late 1920s, early 1930s. De Saussure proposed that languages were constructed of hidden rules that practitioners know but are unable to articulate. In other words, though we may all speak the same language, we are not all able to fully articulate the grammatical rules that govern why we arrange words in the order we do. However, we understand these rules of an implicit as opposed to explicit level, and we are aware when we correctly use these rules when we are able to successfully decode what another person is saying to us. Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1988 to 2009, is widely regarded as the father of structural anthropology. In the 1940s, he proposed that the proper focus of anthropological investigations was on the underlying patterns of human thought that produce the cultural categories that organize worldviews hitherto studied. He believed these processes were not deterministic of culture, but instead operated within culture, whatever that means. His work was heavily influenced by Emile Durkheim.
Wait, repeat that part that you didn't understand?
He believed these processes were not deterministic.
What processes? Can you go back another sentence? Sorry.
In the 1940s, he proposed that the proper focus of anthropological investigations was on the underlying patterns of human thought that produce the cultural categories that organize worldviews hitherto studied. It's not going to get too specific. We just to get us going. He believed these processes were not deterministic of culture, but instead operated within culture. His work was heavily influenced by Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss, right, as well as the Prague School of Structural Linguistics, which include Roman Jacobson, 1896 to 1982, and Nikolai Trubetskoy, 1890 to 1938. From the latter, he derived the concept of binary contrast, later referred to in his work as binary oppositions, which became fundamental in his theory. All right, okay, I've got a little bit more. All right, so we got something about structuralism there. What do you think, Lindsay? What would you add to that? How would you? Do you dispute that? I mean, do you?
Oh no! I mean, I'm not an anthropologist. I think one thing that what you were saying about Saussure reminds me of, right, is that you were saying something about playing by rules, right? And I think the word even play might have even come up. I'm not sure. But certainly rules, right? That people understand,
yes.
that people intuitively understand the rules if they cannot explain them, right? But they like know when something belongs and doesn't belong. They know how to make sense of things, how to communicate, right? And so to me, that sounds a lot like the late Wittgenstein, if we're philosophers, right? So that sounds a lot like language games, right? That like not everybody can exactly say what the rules are, right? But like, a change in the rules changes the game, etc. So that's maybe an interesting connection, like as to bring it into maybe more familiar territory for some of the people at this table.
Right, and I think that was a great thing to point out. My concern was when I said, I don't know about this, is that where do those rules proceed from? Do they proceed from the human mind, or are they sort of like on this level where they are somehow indirectly shaped by the language?
Yeah, so I think like something to think about with structuralism, we were talking about this off camera a minute ago, is I don't think structuralism is concerned with the origins of the rules. I think structuralism is concerned with describing the rules and characterizing the rules, right? And that's not, you might think that's a fault of it, because I think you're interested in like finding this origin and figuring out where these things come from, right? But I think that might just be like, that's not what that, I mean, there's probably reasons why structuralism doesn't value that particular like course of inquiry. My sense of post-structuralism is that it wants to bring back this more temporality to this description of systems of differences and systems of rules for language and for, I guess, like structure and culture. So I think we can start to see Derrida kind of doing that in this essay. And
I think you're right. Yeah. And in what I understand Derrida to be doing is like structuralists think that they're not concerned with foundations and origins, but I think the general thrust of this essay that we'll cover tonight is Derrida is going to say, actually, you unconsciously are concerned with centers and places of origin. So as much as the structuralists want to get away from that, there might be something Platonistic or Platonist about what they're doing. Something else I want to do is I just wanted to very quickly, I'm sorry that I'm reading so much, but I really do think it would be helpful. We throw around the word empiricism a lot, and we're going to contrast that a lot with structuralism and deconstruction, and I think it's helpful to bring this out. Not everyone has a clear understanding of that. From the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a very reputable source, I found the following. Empiricists endorse the following claim for some subject area. The empiricism thesis. We have no source of knowledge in S or for the concepts we use in S other than sense experience. Empiricism, and this I think is important for what we're talking about in terms of origins, empiricism about a particular subject rejects the corresponding version of the intuition deduction thesis and innate knowledge thesis. Insofar as we have knowledge in the subject, our knowledge is a posteriori, dependent upon sense experience. Empiricists also deny the implication of the corresponding innate concept thesis that we have innate ideas in the subject area, since sense experience is our only source of ideas. So, this is this idea about where do these rules come from? And we're going to see that empiricism is going to be a stark contrast to this idea of there being something innate in the human mind, okay? The last thing I wanted to cover, and something that, we tried to get at through this essay, but I don't think we're going to be successful, and I don't think if we examine the entire Derridian, am I saying that right? Derridian corpus, is trying to understand precisely what deconstruction is. I think in some ways, I wonder if our very examination of this essay is a process of deconstruction, and we are sort of exhibit A. I'm not really sure if the contents of what we say is as important as how we go about doing this essay, right? So it might be more of an activity than something we can state. Now, the overview that I was able to surmise was that Derrida really didn't welcome this term deconstruction until maybe later in his career, and even then, he very episodically tried to define it. And then again, I went to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I found that to be unhelpful for our purposes because it was like a 14-page entry. And I actually relied a little bit more on Wikipedia for this. And I think it will also help us to understand Derrida when he refers to metaphysics of presence. That is something he takes us as just understanding. I did not understand what that meant until I looked this up. And also what exactly Derrida is doing in literary criticism. And then we're going to get to the text. I'm just going to do these things. Okay. according to Derrida, and taking inspiration from the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, Saussure, language is a system of signs, and words only have meaning because of the contrast between these signs. I really wish we had read that last week. Mm-hmm. As Rorty contends, and these are Rorty's words, words have meaning only because of contrast effects with other words. No word can acquire meaning in the way in which philosophers from Aristotle to Bertrand Russell have hoped it might, by being the unmediated expression of something non-linguistic, i.e., an emotion, a sense datum, a physical object, an idea, a Platonic form. As a consequence, meaning is never present, but rather is deferred to other signs. Derrida refers to the, in his view, mistaken belief that there is a self-sufficient, non-deferred meaning as metaphysics of presence. A concept then must be understood in the context of its opposite, such as being, nothingness, normal, abnormal, speech, writing, etc. Okay, in the metaphysics of presence. I know I'm boring CJ, but we're going to get you back here, buddy. Yeah. Derrida describes the task of deconstruction as the identification of metaphysics of presence, or logocentrism in Western philosophy. Metaphysics of presence is the desire for immediate access to meaning, the privileging of presence over absence. This means that there is an assumed bias in certain binary oppositions where one side is placed in a position of one over another, such as good over bad, speech over the written word, male over female, among other oppositions. Derrida writes, without a doubt, Aristotle thinks of time on the basis of ousia as parousia, I don't know my Greek, sorry, on the basis of the now, the point, etc., and yet an entire reading could be organized that would repeat in Aristotle's text both this limitation and its opposite. To Derrida, the central bias of logocentrism was the now being placed as the more important than the future or past. The argument is largely based on the earlier work of Heidegger, who in Being and Time claimed that the theoretical attitude of pure presence is parasitical upon a more originary involvement with the world and concepts such as the right at hand and being with. I could go on, but that would maybe not be super helpful. Let's just get into it. Okay, we've got enough background.
That was really helpful. Mm-hmm.
I think it is helpful. Okay, let's get into this essay, guys. All right, so where we left off last time was Derrida had just started to explore Levi-Strauss's ethnology, right? And he said that there was the bricolage, right? And bricolage, or to be a bricoleur, meant to kind of take the broken pieces of something and make something out of it, right? But he thinks what's being made in ethnological studies is some sort of mythopoem or mythopoetical activity. Now, I didn't quite understand what he meant there, because I thought bricolage was like an intellectual activity, not necessarily a mythopoetical activity. So, I didn't know what he was trying to say. My first read of that was that what he was trying to say in this, trying to do ethnology, was that he was a bricoleur and in a way creating his own sort of myth. So ethnology is its own sort of mythopoem, right? And then I started to wonder, well, is he trying to say that all human science narratives can be elaborated out from this idea that we're really just bricoleurs within this particular human science of ethnology? Okay, so discuss.
He goes on, I think, on the next page, right? On 8? Maybe it's on 7. Oh, no, it's on 7. In opposition to the epistemic discourse, structural discourse on myths, mythological discourse must itself be mythomorphic.
Yes.
Right? It must have the form of that of which it speaks.
Yeah.
That seems to be a very Derridian move. I think that it's hard to get outside of a discourse, right? It's hard to like speak authoritatively, to speak objectively about something, because it's what you're doing is like not subsumed, but participating maybe in the thing that's being studied. Did you guys talk about what mythomorphic means, or what is the mythological here? Like what characterizes it?
No.
Okay.
No, that was the thing that we were struggling with at the end of
okay.
of last
I don't have
week.
like a ready answer, so I would
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, so it seemed like I mean, CJ, do you want to jump in there? I mean, it seemed like Levi-Strauss is searching for the new status of the discourse without necessarily having a reference to a center. But I think what Derrida might be saying is mythomorphic about what he's doing is creating a historical illusion that there may actually be a center to ethnological studies. That may be the thing that is mythopoetic about it. And even though like this, the theme of decentering ran through a lot of Levi-Strauss's work, especially the book The Raw and Cooked, which I don't know how much familiarity you have with that one, Lindsay. So
I've never read any Levi-Strauss that I can remember. So. Yeah,
and I guess in that book, and Derrida takes some time to point this out, is that he wanted to take 2 points here for the Raw and the Cooked. And Derrida says that Levi-Strauss used this Bororo myth as a reference myth that to show that essentially that I didn't really know what that was. He says it didn't really. I don't know if that meant like it was a founding myth or whatever, but perhaps that like Levi-Strauss secretly knew that all myths were just sort of transformations and different iterations or permutations of them. For those who are not familiar, and I was not familiar with this, Levi-Strauss apparently in 1938 went to went to visit these Bororo indigenous people in Brazil, I guess a region called Mato Grosso or something like that, and he analyzed a particular myth and 187 myths, and he reconstructed socio-cultural formations using binary oppositions based on sensory qualities. Whatever that means. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The second point that Derrida points out is that the result of this study is that there's no unity or absolute source of the myth of the Bororo people. It's acentric. It's all about structures, configurations, the relationship. No absolute subject or center. And we have to avoid centering language so as not to do violence to structure. You've got to renounce philosophical scientific discourses that search for a founding. And mythological discourses must be mythomorphic, having the form of myth. So what are the ramifications of this? What's the takeaway for other discourses here? We're talking about how, if you're participating in a discourse, you sort of necessarily become it, right? With this mythomorphic thing with doing ethnography. I wonder about where are the ramifications in the other human sciences, the hard sciences, whatever else. But I thought what was interesting here is that Derrida does point out about how Levi-Strauss's book, if read a certain way, does have sort of a musical nature, where like signs and things like that kind of come in and out. CJ, that seemed to really resonate with you being our most established musician.
Oh no, it was really cool because there's a little quip on page 8 where he uses a Levi-Strauss passage, and Strauss, I think, or Levi-Strauss compares it to music, but in a different way though, where he says, "The myth and the musical work thus appear as orchestra conductors whose listeners are the silent performers. If it be asked where the real focus of the work is to be found, it must be replied that its determination is impossible. Music and mythology bring man face to face with virtual objects whose shadow alone is actual. Myths have no authors." And that's a kind of crazy thing where it's like you're in it, and yet you can't really define what you're in, I suppose. Or that's what it sounds like, where it's like the listeners are the people performing the music. So if you ask them, like, what happened? You're kind of like, I was playing the song. I don't really know what was happening. So I think that's a fascinating analogy to take.
Yeah, so if we step back from this, right? All right, if we get comfortable with this idea of just like myths displacing myth, or right, like what does this say about structuralism and deconstruction in general, right? Like what exactly Derrida is trying to get us to go at with discourses by considering how Levi-Strauss handles myths in The Raw and the Cooked. Like Lindsay, I think you were saying earlier, the something to the effect that like signs it's not so much that that signs have their meaning because they have an absolute reference point in the center.
Yeah, that was like something you read, I think.
Yeah, or maybe I read it. Something to the effect of that signs have their meaning only in relation to other signs. And similarly how like myths really only have their meaning in other myths, and it just can go on and on and on and on. And like kind of the Derridian move is to understand what signs are by comparison to other signs, right? Like to have being, we have to have nothingness as well, right?
Well, that's not the Derridian move. I mean, that's a Saussure move too. That precedes Derrida.
Oh.
So an interest in binaries is not like, he's not like the first guy who was like, things only make sense in relationship to their opposite. What I think that difference, the idea of difference is important to Saussure as I understand it. So I've read like Elementary Structure of Linguistics like a long time ago, which is a Saussure book that this stuff comes from. And so the idea of difference is important to him. And it's just like things are, I think in the chain of signifiers, you make sense of things by slight alterations and slight differences, right? So like,
yes.
If you cannot differentiate one thing from another, you can't have language, right? Like that seems important. You can't really have anything. You can't have thought, I think, right? And so I don't think Derrida is like the first person to like point that out, right? But I think this doesn't really. This is in response to one of the things that you read about deconstruction, not so much in response to something here. I do think that something that Derrida adds to it is that you can't have difference without hierarchy, right? So this idea with Saussure is that like, yeah, you have boy and you have girl. Great. You have black and you have white. Fine. But Derrida's like, no. Like, those contain within them a value judgment. You think they don't, but there's something there. And that has to do with the metaphysics of presence.
Yes. Do you want to riff on that for a little bit? Because it feels like you have a good handle on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not as good about the presence stuff, but I think, I mean, so the metaphysics of presence stuff is a way in which Derrida is bringing in time and temporality in a way that structuralism doesn't seem to be interested in doing. And so these idea, like Derrida uses words like, in translation, we get words like slippage and stuff like that are these words that seem to have spatial and temporal elements to them. So, I mean, can I talk about difference, which is like for the end?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
So, I mean, something that I told Luke a bit ago about like thinking through this, or was like talking to Luke about is, so we're reading Derrida in translation, and he's teaching us a lot about language, and so we want to pay attention to the translation, right? I mean, anytime we're reading anything in translation, you should be thinking about it, right? But like, I think for somebody who is like, we're having difficulty with his language, we're not sure what his terms are, right? Like, they're not the words that he used, but he's in, they're in translation, and so our version has some footnotes.
Did he give this lecture in French? Because it was in America.
Yeah, I don't know.
And I've seen the documentary. He does have particularly good control of the English language.
Yeah, I mean,
or at least he did in the 2000s when the documentary was made.
Yeah, yes, I've seen him speak English. I don't know the answer to that. I'm taking the notes which are about translation as like, suggesting that like the footnotes that we have at the end of this document.
Yeah.
I'm taking them as suggesting that this was originally in French.
Yeah.
I don't. Wait, it actually says it right here. So, la structure, le signe et le jeu dans le discours des sciences humaines. The text which follows is a translation of the revised version of Derrida's communication. The word jeu is variously translated here. So this is one of the first things to point out, right? The word jeu is variously translated here as play, interplay, game, and stake. Besides the normative translation, free play. All footnotes to the article are additions by the translator, right? So think about that, right? Like in this text that we're reading the word play, we're reading the word interplay, game, stake, and free play, which I know you were talking about last time, right? All of those are the same word, or like the same 3 letters in a row in the French, right? It's like, think of how different that would be, right? Like if you were reading this and like all those things were the same, right? And so he's, like it's going to make a different impression in French, right? And like some of this is going to be stuff that's a little bit out of his control, I think, like how things are going to come across, what choices the translator is going to make, or just sort of the like peculiarities of French and English, right? So there's also this, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it now, but like when he uses it's the word we get is interdicted. It's in italics, and it has a footnote on page 1. It has footnote or endnote 2 on it. Mm-hmm. At least this permutation has always remained interdicted. Parentheses, I use this word deliberately, right? So like that's, I feel like, a moment when you want to be like, all right, Derrida, like, what do you mean you use that word deliberately? Like, you're using every word deliberately, aren't you? And so when I look at the footnote, right, and it says interdit, forbidden, disconcerted, confounded, and speechless, right? So this word, right, when something's I think, for me, forbidden is what comes up for interdicted in English, right? But what we're losing is the dicte, right, which is about speech, right? And so this word is a pun. Like, he's using it as forbidden, right? So like it has, I think my sense of it is that it has both meanings in French, right? That interdit is forbidden, but it also means not speaking, speechless, right? Or like forbidden speech in some way, right? Because dite would be like something involving speech in French, right? Why am I talking about translation? To be aware of the subtleties of language here, and to like try not to like, push so hard on pinning Derrida down on like what any of these particular words means, right? And so I guess I give that introduction also to talk about difference, which is one of these weird words that has to do with translation. So this is the top of our last page, conveniently by my footnotes. For my part, although these two interpretations must acknowledge and accentuate their difference and define their irreducibility, I do not believe that today there is any question of choosing in the first place, because here we are in a region, let's say provisionally, a region of historicity, where the category of choice seems particularly trivial, etc., etc. So the idea of difference comes up in a lot of other Derrida, and it's kind of beyond, it reaches beyond his work now. And this is from another essay, but difference is a word he made up,
right? And
so we get it here in French, right? Not translated. It looks like the word difference. It's spelled like the word difference in English here, but we have the accent on it. I've also seen it presented in English as having ending in ance. Rather than ence, right? And so that's like not an English word. So that's usually actually how I would write it, because then you notice it as like it sounds, and this is interesting about it, right? It sounds like it can sound like an English word, but it looks different. And what he's doing with it is like combining a couple different French words into one, because it's not a word in French either, right? Like it's something that he made up. And so the idea here, and it works pretty well in English, is that it's different or differing, right? Like with this thing that we're talking about, like differences between black and white, male, female, whatever. But it's also deferring, right? It's also putting off. It's also adding a temporal element, right? So the idea with difference to me is like, in a way, it's kind of spatial, if you think about it, right? Mm-hmm. That you can like see some kind of difference in things. But that to defer is to add a temporal element, right? Is to put something off, is to introduce the idea of presence and absence into things. And so for him, difference is something that's operating in language all the time. So you can't have pure presence. And this is really going off.
That's fine.
From this essay. I hope, okay.
I'm loving listening to it.
So he... in Plato's Pharmacy, I think is where it is. Well, it's in the essay Difference. I think it's also in Plato's Pharmacy, which I forget. Writing in Difference, I forget actually what book that's in. He is interested in this idea of like, so one of the things that you read in your introduction to deconstruction was like some of the binaries that he's interested in disrupting were like male, female, presence, absence, speech, writing, right? And he's really interested in this idea that like this like thing about speech and writing, because he thinks that he's looking at Plato's Phaedrus and seeing this sort of like long history of thinking that speech is somehow preferable, better, more pure, more immediate. Or preferable because it is more pure and immediate than writing,
right.
Which makes sense,
yeah.
Right? Like what we are doing here, you're very interested in these things, I think. And so we can see, I think it's a little bit easier to see difference at work or at play, as it were, in writing, right? Because you can see that like words have histories, words are interacting with other things. We don't have control over our work once it's out of our hands. It can be interpreted differently, right? So it's not immediate. There's some kind of temporal element. There's some kind of delay. But for him, he's like difference is operating in speech as well, right? And so if that's operating in all language and all of its possible uses, right? Like that is something that's supposed to like disrupt this binary between speech and writing. Like if the idea that they like that a fundamental difference between speech and writing is in this thing about immediacy, right? Him pointing out that that language is never fully present, that there's not like that it doesn't have this authoritative thing, I guess, that it's like bringing into the present. Or
there's no
like
totalization of it,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it can also, there can be, and there's a couple senses, right, in that there's no totalization of it, right? Like
yes.
it can also be expounded upon, right? There can be limitless sort of terms that we can introduce.
Yeah,
right?
okay,
and,
yeah.
And gradations, right? And then I think you mentioned another sense that it was total, but not necessarily in terms of that. But what I think we kind of, if we can kind of get our head around this a little bit, like, so why does he spend all this time talking about Levi-Strauss and using him as like this, and not necessarily in a kind way, this poster boy for structuralism, right? So is it just, what is it about Levi-Strauss that he's doing that is so structuralist, and what is Derrida reacting to that goes on in the raw and the cooked?
Right.
Like if the that's the thing that's the thing I'm so struggling with, and I don't know if it's like sort of the elevation of that Baroro myth to something as being like this founding myth, not unlike our Garden of Eden or something like that.
Right. But I mean, but he like points to Levi-Strauss admitting that issue, you know, because like I think that's it, is that like in a lot of these things, right? Like he's noting Levi-Strauss noting his criticism, you know, like it's like I don't take it as being like super hard on Levi-Strauss, the whole thing. Because like there's that point where like Levi-Strauss says like, you know, I picked this myth, but it could be another one. Like I could have picked another one as my, not origin, but what does he call it? I forget what he's calling it. But the like reference myth or something like that, right? You know, he's like any number of them would have worked okay. And then there's some other point, I feel like maybe it might actually be earlier, where he's like, you know, acknowledges that he's like caught up in the structure of what he's doing.
Well, he says on page 8, it is at this point that ethnographic bricolage deliberately assumes its mythopoetic function, but by the same token, this function makes the philosophical epistemological requirement of a center appear as mythological, that is to say, as a historical illusion. So I kind of wanted to get at if we understood what this difference was between sort of philosophical scientific theorem and the mythopoems or whatever that are going on in ethnology. It seems like we're supposed to draw some lesson from what Levi-Strauss did in anthropology so that we eschew trans-philosophical concepts like truth, history, whatever, and advocate philosophy and I suppose even science to some degree and being done differently, being read differently. So I don't know what exact, and I don't even know if it's obvious to Derrida what he has in mind, because he presents us with two interpretations of interpretation at the end. One of them he seems to attribute to Levi-Strauss, like that there is like some underlying center, and another to some new monstrosity that he can't really name.
Yep. Has it yet to be born or something? I forget what it is. Yeah.
It's like a dawning of a new era. And maybe that goes back to the rupture in the event that he mentions at the beginning of the essay.
Well, it also goes back to the question of incest.
Yeah,
as like birthing a monstrosity. Like it's a right. You know,
I see.
Yeah,
it's
I think that's I think that's a poetic move. I think more than it's anything. But yeah. So that's me being a English teacher for you.
No, that's okay.
But yeah, but to get back to your question about like what's happening here with faults in the philosophical field and whatnot.
Well, I think the other thing that was sort of interesting is that he's like Levi-Strauss also, in addition to not sort of understanding that there is sort of this centering language and process in what he's doing, there's something very empiricistic or characterized by empiricism.
Empirical?
Something very empirical, we should say. we talked about this whole attempt at totalization. And he says on page 9, the structural schemata are always proposed as hypotheses resulting from a finite quantity of information and which are subjected to the proof of experience. And it's just that there's just so much to say about myths. There's always going to be new things that come in. Also, the field excludes totalization in the fact that there's just so much free play. There's an infinite amount of substitutions within the sort of closed finite ensemble. There's going to that. I think that's why you're saying that there is some sort of empirical element going on there. But I don't know. But part of the reason why that it is resistant to totalization is what Derrida picks up on page 9. There is something missing from it. A center which arrests and founds the free play of substitutions. So I guess if we're going back to all the different myths, there's always a new myths that can be formed. If we're talking about language, there are new signs, new permutations, new iterations, and stuff like that, because there's nothing to arrest that free play. There's no center saying, go no further. I don't know. I'm doing a lot of talking.
Right, let me just read this from the standpoint of the concept of free play. If totalization no longer has any meaning, it is not because the infinity of a field cannot be covered by a finite glance or a finite discourse, but because the nature of the field, that is, language and a finite language, excludes totalization. This field is in fact that of free play, that is to say, a field of infinite substitutions in the closure of a finite ensemble. This field permits these infinite substitutions only because it is finite, that is to say, because instead of being an inexhaustible field, as in the classical hypothesis, instead of being too large, there is something missing from it, a center which arrests and founds the free play of substitutions. I feel like we're thinking of some kind of infinite... isn't this thing that happens in weird 19th century mathematics or whatever, is that there's this paradoxical kind of infinity, you can take infinity and take one number out of it and then it's not infinite, but it still kind of is infinite. I don't know, Cantor did that or something like that. There's a little bit of that happening here, right? So this might be a reference to something earlier, I think, but I hope it will help us understand this. He's playing with this idea. I feel like this isn't stuff you covered last time, so
it's fine. Forgive
me if you already kind of got to this. I don't know that I'm ever going to find it. But this talking about decentering, talking about the structurality of structure. My sense of it is that there's this center that has been removed, right? And so it's hard to. And the center is basically you can't characterize a structure without a center, I think is what's going on, is that the center is the structure. I mean, there are more things within the structure, right, than the center, but the center is the only way you can talk about what a structure is, right? And I think a center is a difference. I think a center is a distinction between things, if that makes sense, right? So the center of the question of nature culture is whatever we can do to decide what goes in column A and what goes in column B.
Yeah, why don't you elaborate on that, especially in regards to the incest prohibition? I think you had a good handle on that from our offline conversation.
So that's my sense of things, is that, and I wish I had done a better job of rereading and highlighting and stuff and finding the right point for this.
No, I think displacement. You think can and not can, right?
Right. No. I can. Yeah. I mean, I can riff on it. I just I feel I want to anybody can riff on this, right? I want to make sense of the text for people so that the text doesn't seem this opaque thing. I think I might have it though. Okay, this is on the first page. That has always been thought that the center. Thus, it has always been thought that the center, which is by definition unique, constituted that very thing within a structure which governs the structure while escaping structurality, right? So I'm maybe making it a bit of a shorthand to say that the center is the structure, right? But the center is the thing that makes the structure work, right?
You wouldn't have a structure without a center.
Right, yes.
It's the foundation.
Yes, good. But yet at the same time, that center is supposed to escape structurality in some way. This is why classical thought concerning structure could say that the center is, paradoxically, within the structure and outside it. That's the line that I want. The center is at the center of the totality, and yet, since the center does not belong to the totality, is not part of the totality has its center elsewhere. So this is getting at that totalization thing that I think that we're getting at later, right? This is the center that's been removed, and now we have this infinite, non-infinite thing, right? The center is not the center, right, is then what he says. The concept of centered structure, although it represents coherence itself, the condition of the episteme as philosophy or science is contradictorily coherent. Okay, good. Okay, so the center is paradoxically within the structure and outside of it. The structure has it, the totality has its center elsewhere. So I think I was talking to you about the idea of the example and the idea of the exception, and how those things are like, in a way, this is just another structure, but if you go with it. So if we have a structure, we'll use the nature-culture, we'll use the nature-culture distinction, that's fine. And so the center of that structure is like the ability to differentiate between those things, right? And so somehow we need to take that, like, we're making sense of that, we're characterizing that, I think, like, without using the terms of that structure. And if everything is supposed to be decidable within a structure, everything is either nature or culture, right? What do we do with, like, the ability to, or the concept of that difference? Does that make sense? Like, if we take it to another meta level, right? Yeah. Is the concept of the difference between nature and culture a cultural construct? Or is it natural? I don't know.
Yeah.
And so is that something that then is an exception from this structure that's supposed to be totalizable or totalizing? It's supposed to be able to encompass, like, everything in human experience or whatever, right? Since we're in the field of anthropology, we're talking about the field of human experience or human life, human culture. And so then that's this thing that's like, that is now an exception to the structure, right? It is a thing that does not fit, right? Yet it is a thing that controls and defines and gives sense to that structure, right? So it is in a way part of the structure, right? Because the structure doesn't make any sense without it, right? It's just a bunch of gibberish or whatever. It's nothing if you don't have that. So it's part of it's inside. Yet it's, I think, not decidable within it, and so it's an exception.
Yeah.
Right? So something that is an exception, you see, right? It's outside and inside at the same time. So this is this idea of having a center elsewhere, of the center is not the center, right? And this, to me, this is all, I'm using a lot of spatial metaphors to talk about this. I don't have any way of conceiving of this, right, without thinking of, like, there's a circle and it's inside and it's out, thinking spatially.
I can't blame you.
Yeah. And so, yeah, and I think that's what
and Derrida invites it by talking about...
Oh, yeah, no, and that's fine, yeah. But I think that, like, maybe one of the things that he does here is, like, add this temporal element to it. So, I'm on page 2, I think. This moment was that in which language invaded the universal problematic, that in which, in the absence of a center or origin, everything became discourse, provided we can agree on this word. That is to say, when everything became a system where the central signified, the original or transcendental signified, is never absolutely present outside a system of differences. The absence of the transcendental signified extends the domain and the interplay of signification ad infinitum.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, like, there's something here about him pointing out the center's not the center anymore, this exception thing, right? That adds in here in free play signification, like interplay of signs ad infinitum, that it adds maybe some kind of deferral, some kind of temporal element that, like, we can't ever, like, figure these things out.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I want to bring CJ and Jordan back
Yes.
into the conversation because we've been doing a lot of talking. I want to see what they have to contribute, perhaps ask us about clarifications or anything like that.
So what? Who cares? What can we take from this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
read this.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, where are we at? I mean, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I guess that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few more things to say, but I mean, we haven't gotten to these concepts of supplementarity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I skip to the end, let's skip to the end and try to address CJ's question, okay? Because I have questions. I'm getting kind of hung up in the details about the differences between Levi-Strauss and Derrida himself. Mm-hmm. He talks about, all right, so this whole discourse can be characterized. We've got two choices. We've got two interpretations of structure, sign, free play. Mm-hmm. The first is a direct quote from page 12, and I believe he thinks this is what Levi-Strauss is doing. The one seeks to decipher, dreams of deciphering a truth or an origin which is free from free play, from the order of the sign, and lives like an exile, the necessity of interpretation. Mm-hmm. The other, which we've been talking about here at great length, no longer turn toward the origin, affirms free play, passes beyond man, full presence, reassuring foundation, origin, and the end of the game. And this is a celebratory sort of viewpoint derived from Nietzsche. Right? And maybe we can talk about this in regards to what the Nietzschean project in general. Whatever Derrida is after in deconstruction, it's not going to be interested in a new humanism, which I believe he thought Levi-Strauss was interested in. And I don't know if that is because Levi-Strauss, with all these different structures of myth and this reference myth, thought that there was some sort of underlying thing that united everyone in the creation of different myths and language, right? But ultimately, Derrida is going to say that these two different interpretations of interpretation are irreconcilable. And I think that's, in some way, gets at this paradox of the incest prohibition. And like you said, CJ, last time, maybe you were right. We got into this little dispute about whether or not this only mattered to the human sciences or the harder, more empirical sciences. I think Jordan and I were more on the side that this applied to everything, and you were thinking more of the science. I think he may really have in mind the human sciences, but I don't even begin to know. And I don't think, even though Derrida embraces this route, I'm not really sure Derrida knows what he's giving birth to. And I think it's a lot of, I mean, it's Nietzschean in that respect, right? Like, Nietzsche talks about this sort of deconstruction, right, through his genealogy of morals, of what good and bad and evil and what strength and what all that means, right? But it's really hard to say what the Übermensch is, isn't it? I've always found it hard to characterize what the Übermensch is. It's hard for me, personally, to tell you what Nietzsche's Übermensch is. I know it's not what Hitler had in mind, but in a vacuum, Hitler took it upon himself to define what the Übermensch was. And in a vacuum, we get these Marvel Comics superheroes and things like that too, but probably not what Nietzsche had in mind either, because he probably didn't want some strong man saving weak people. So, I don't know. I think all we're left is sort of a fork in the road. I mean, we can go into deeper elements about supplementarity, but I mean, that's ultimately what we're left with, right? I don't know. I mean, Lindsay has a little bit more of a familiarity of where Derrida goes from here. Do you know kind of what he develops?
I mean, I guess I don't feel comfortable speaking authoritatively. Yeah, I mean, he talks about all kinds of different things, but
what I find kind of cool is that he sort of, I think on page 12, he sort of says, like, there's two different ways to look at it. There's, like, you don't have a center. There's the glass half full and the glass half empty kind of style. You have I think what he calls the negative, which is just like, oh no, we lost the center. It's not there. It's kind of nostalgic. You're like, oh man, I think like you're saying with Levi-Strauss, if only we could just reach back and get that center, that origin. But then there's the glass half full where it's like, fuck yeah, there's no center. I'm going to play all night long. I think that's Nietzsche and all those guys where it's an affirmation. So I think that's a fascinating way too, or maybe that brings it into maybe some sort of relevancy where it's like, okay, you don't have a center. How are you going to look at it? Are you going to try to just reach for air and try to find that center, or are you going to play? Are you going to go with it and affirm the non-center? I suppose you gain a non-center instead of losing a center, I suppose, right? So it's almost like you're presented with two ways to look at it, or what do you do with it?
Well, the thing is, I I can understand why people have such visceral reactions to Derrida. I was telling everybody earlier that if you go and watch the YouTube documentary and look at the comments for it, that people have some, like, are just savage on him, or very, very, say, like a very vile things. Because what this would, if it is all about free play, I mean, how do we not get to this position that all human pursuits of knowledge don't become sort of these absurdist endeavors that don't really stand for anything because they have no founding that makes sense of the structure at large? Like, it all kind of becomes like a kind of ridiculous game, does it not? Now, he seems to delight in it. Delight in this sort of what appears to be a nihilistic destruction of discourse. But, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what if Levi-Strauss's approaches to ethnology and anthropology isn't good enough for him? I mean, what are we left for in terms of knowledgeable pursuits?
I feel like he said something earlier about Levi-Strauss noticing, and that. I mean, are you familiar with the concept of strategic essentialism?
I'm not.
Yeah. So, essentialism is going to be something that, like, Derrida doesn't like. Essentialism is going to be this kind of, like, there's a transcendental signified, or, like, there's a truth out there that stops somewhere, right? And the idea of strategic essentialism doesn't come from Derrida, but it's, like, something that I think circulates around a lot of discourses that are could be accused of nihilism. And that is that, like, you got to write a paper. You got to use language. You got to teach a class. You got to live your life, right? And there are times when it is strategic to, if not believe in, behave as if you believe in, work within, operate as if structures are centered or things are real, right? And there's all kinds of ways in which we do that all the time, I think. And so I think that at the same time that Derrida is very playful with language deliberately, right, in a sort of embodiment and celebration of free play, right, that he uses a word like interdite that has all these different meanings. And,
interpretation of interpretation, structure of structures, supplementarity, of course, right? And that's what I was going at earlier. We're telling you is that what we've done here, have we demonstrated Derrida's point? Are we having fun? Are we having fun yet?
I guess I don't. I think that maybe I'm not. I don't know if I'm getting the idea of what you're saying, because, like, we're trying to define words really precisely, right? And so, are you saying are we like doing?
We're struggling,
right? So
we're illustrating a lot of what the deconstructionist project is. Okay. And that's really what deconstruction does, is to implode all this stuff, and that we should just watch it burn.
Or maybe that it's impossible to actually, like, conceive of an origin, because it's like you have to stop time in and of itself. I think on page 12, I think at the top, he's talking about this idea that to conceive of the origin is almost like this catastrophe, like you're overturning nature and just freeze, everything just stop, and you can't do. Maybe Derrida's saying you can't do that, and us trying to wrestle with this text is trying to stop information and everything from moving, and you're just I don't know. Maybe it's just impossible. I don't know. I really don't know. Jordan, do you know?
What do you think, Jordan?
What? I mean, I don't know. I like the just like thinking about time in this work, just because I like the idea of the sort of like the reference myth, and I like how time works in myths because it's like beyond our own sort of comprehension, and there's like this like constant renewal. So with like oral tradition, typically in myths, basically the framework of time is completely distorted because you're also participating in it. So it totally just like throws everything. So I just like the idea of everything being thrown in this.
And what do you mean by you're participating in it?
You're living it. So it's not necessarily when you're sort of retelling a mythic story, you're placing yourself in that sort of continuum. So it's not like once upon a time, it's sort of like once upon a time, but right now. So that's kind of the cool thing about oral tradition and stuff like that, which I'm sure Levi-Strauss must have looked at when he was, you know, studying all of these sort of archaic peoples, because the sort of traditional Western linear concepts of time don't really cleanly apply to the sense of mythic time.
So you're saying that once upon a time is also now... Do you mean in the sense of like an origin story and just like we're still feeling the effects of this? So
it's like you're living it. Like you're like basically experiencing the narrative in real time. So it's not once upon a time, because by retelling the story, you are like, it's a renewal of it. So it's more of like a cyclical thing instead of a straight linear experience.
So in telling the story at that moment, the narrative is going to be like, once upon a time, Rapunzel said...
Once upon a time, starting now.
Okay.
Basically.
And then when you're presenting the story, the person's presenting the story, they are in that moment.
So that's why a lot of indigenous peoples, especially in... people, especially in North America... That's why oral traditions are so strong to many indigenous people, because it is as real to them as it was 100,000 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
So, and a lot of times memory and oral tradition is bound also up in a particular place. Yeah. So you also sort of inherit a cultural memory that you constantly relive telling that tale.
Gosh.
So this time exists outside of our own Western conceptions of time.
Which is also to say that it's timeless, right?
Right,
like,
yeah.
You know, like, I think that's the other, like... And I think that fits with what I've been trying to say about structuralism, right? Is that, like... That the myth is present. Like, that the myth is just... It's not, there. Like, this long history of something.
Yeah.
But we look at it that way, right? Like, an anthropologist from the outside might... But that, in its lived form, right? It doesn't have that. So, bottom of 11... One can therefore describe what is peculiar to the structural organization only by not taking into account, in the very moment of this description, its past conditions. Yeah. By failing to pose the problem of the passage from one structure to another, by putting history into parentheses. In this structuralist moment, the concepts of chance and discontinuity are indispensable.
Yeah, keep going. I had this underscored as well. Okay. So, why don't you finish the next
sentence? And Levi-Strauss does, in fact, often appeal to them, as them being the concepts of discontinuity and chance. For instance, for that structure of structures, language, of which he says in the introduction to the work of Marcel Mauss that it, quote, could only have been born in one fell swoop.
I thought this was really significant, right? Because he's saying that Levi-Strauss, my interpretation of this, right, and there might be something analogous to our own sort of Garden of Eden story in the relationship to language, is that the way that Levi-Strauss sort of portrays it is that there was nothing and then there was something, right? And so he's taken away these founding centers, but like has reintroduced this like poof magical moment. Now I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, what way does Derrida want us to have it, right? Like, if that is a dissatisfactory... Why is that a dissatisfactory way? I mean, not only because it's like this... I guess he calls that a catastrophe. Like, there's, like, this magical event where we go from non-meaning to meaning. But what else is Levi-Strauss supposed to do if he doesn't sort of focus it on historical precedent? From going from structure to structure, but saying, no, there is this sort of event that occurs where language is born into existence. You know?
Wait, so you're saying that Derrida wouldn't go for the historical version? Like, he wouldn't like that?
Well, I mean, I think if you have the historical version, then you ultimately are tracing it back to something, so you're finding a center. But then you have to do like this miraculous thing, if you do what Levi-Strauss has said here, where it just sort of magically comes into existence. And he says a new structure is based upon a catastrophe. So, I don't know. So I wonder if that sneaks in something, like if it sneaks in something miraculous, like a presence. That metaphysics of presence, by the fact that you go from non-meaning to meaning. I wonder if that's what he's saying there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that. I mean, my sense is that Derrida is aware of the sort of impossibilities of the stuff that he's talking about. You know, I don't know that he is like thinks that he's putting out here like a clear outline of a philosophical system, right? Like his project here seems to be disruption. It seems to be, it seems to be critique. It seems to be destabilization, decentering, etc. Right?
We have been destabilized,
and so like to look for like, okay, what does Derrida think we should do going forward? What's his plan? Is like, no.
well, maybe this would help a little bit from page 12. Mm-hmm. He says the presence of an element is always a signifying and substitutive reference inscribed in a system of differences in the movement of a chain. Free play is always an interplay of absence and presence. Mm-hmm. But if it is to be radically conceived, free play must be conceived of before the alternative of presence and absence. Being must be conceived of as presence or absence beginning with the possibility of free play and not the other way around. Or not the other way. Yeah. So what does it mean for radical conception here? Free play must be conceived of before the alternative presence of and absence. Before we have any sort of language, we have this ability to play. Like, I don't know what to take away from that.
Being must be conceived of as presence or absence, beginning with the possibility of free play and not the other way around. Yeah, I mean, it's like he's putting play as a center, right?
Yeah, I'm wondering if
well, he goes right into what he said, where he's just like every move is a checkmate away from like every discourse you try to use is
even his own.
That's what it almost seems like. Yeah, where it's
definitely
just
everything's kind of like fair game.
It almost seems like it's just like this whole article is like not a train wreck, but it's almost like a chess problem where it's like checkmate the other side and then checkmate yourself. Like, how can you do that in one fell swoop? And I think Derrida has found a way to checkmate, the system, but then be like, and then I have to checkmate myself and disappear forever. You know what I mean? Like, that's what it almost seems like, where it's just like, the only way to be truly sincere is just to like shut up and not say anything.
Yeah, what happens when you checkmate yourself or whatever, you like concede or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like just like a self-destruction. Maybe that's what maybe that's like that whole like new humanism thing that he's talking about. It's like, I think it's almost like sometimes Foucault talks about it too, where he's just like, I'm just trying to go past humanism and past like my own self and just go beyond that into something that's like new territory or just out of body, like I don't know, like out of
we saw last
human
week,
conceptions. Yeah,
we saw last week that he wasn't going to try to get outside of philosophy.
Right.
He said that wasn't going to be one of the routes that he was going to take.
Right.
So I don't know where he vanishes to. I don't know where he spirits away to.
Right.
I don't have the answers. I don't know.
He just ghosts.
Probably wind it down here.
Yeah. We're at 1 hour and 7 minutes. I mean, we skipped around some stuff. We jumped around. I mean, I think regardless of our kind of, asymmetrical sort of approach to all of this, I mean, I think we kind of got it, the gist of the article, and I hope people find it helpful in some way. I don't know.
What was the takeaway for you? Sometimes with these texts, it's just like they're so confounding that even if you can take away one nugget of information, then that might be worthwhile.
I guess I kind of want to hang on this idea of play as the thing to take away, the thing to hang on, right?
Go on.
So, because I think there was one way of reading this paragraph as saying, like, okay, well, he's taken out the idea of the transcendental signified or of God or whatever and put free play in the middle, and you're like, well, who cares? Like, that seems dumb. Like, if we're trying not to have centers, how can that be a center?
Gotta serve somebody.
Yeah. But I think there might be something about the idea, like, if we get over the word free play and just think of, like, this is this word that encompasses a lot in French, right? That involves game and play. What else is it? What are the words that he was translating? Stake, interplay, all that stuff. That rather than if we don't think of it as a concept, but we think of it as an activity, maybe, or a process or something like that, and as a movement, as a kind of deferral, as like a thing you can't really pin down. Like if things are at play, they're not like definable, right? Like if words are at play, they're like being kind of sneaky. that's what he's giving us. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think it's helpful.
But like that is sort of like, I don't want to say the essence, but a thing that characterizes all signification, I think, is something playful.
Yeah. I mean, me personally, I don't know if I have much more to say about Derrida. I've kind of left it all on the table. But me personally, I think this essay taught me the limits of my current pedagogical stylings and how I certainly need to go about thinking about how I do my prep work. So I would say it's more of a pragmatic takeaway for me. I think I'm at the stage now where it's not that there's a lot that is lost in the hurried desire to explain things, and possibly going slower with secondary resources and more background information is something that I'll probably incorporate into my pedagogical stuff, because there are times where you do need text to complement what we've done here. Sometimes, so there are some texts that speak directly to you. I would say that this one, I wish I had the time to do more secondary material. I know that's like more of a personal problem. Probably shouldn't be sharing it as much. But I'm so proud that we showed up and we fought and we battled through it. I mean, but that's my big takeaway from it.
Yeah.
I as far as discourses go, and like the substance of what he's saying, I don't know. I mean, I'm so interested in outputs. It's hard for me to take his monstrous path. I'm still very much. I still find myself being one of these individuals that dreams of deciphering a truth or an origin. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if he persuaded me to the other side. So I would probably still be in that first interpretation of interpretations.
Jordan? If there was anything, even if it was confusion, I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely think that, to Lindsay's point about translation, if I was fluent in French, I would have loved to have read this in French, because I think that there are many nuances to this. Given his sort of like teasing, playful nature, I think that like there are meanings hiding within meanings, and shifting around the text and like running around. I think that this is a very nuanced text, which so translation is like a key thing for me. And I mean, I don't know. This is like again, like kind of with the Foucault kind of like a weird paradigm thing for me. So this is like definitely completely out of my element, but this is something I want to definitely circle back to.
What about you, CJ?
No, I think the big thing for me is that you need to destroy an opposite, you need the opposite. That was the thing that kind of just blew my mind, when you think of anything.
Right.
Anything. I mean, I was thinking even the idea of gender. You got, LGBTQ or whatever. Like in order to destroy the binary, you need this spectrum of gender. It's still gender. It's still a spectrum of gender, but you're still using gender to destroy gender. And like in like anything that you can think of is that it's always there. And I don't know if that just leaves me confounded and just like, well, what's the point of anything? Like it's like a nihilistic. But I mean, I do like that. There's two ways to look at it. There's that affirmation or negative, where it's like you can just cry over spilt centers, or you can just be like, no, I think this is awesome. I can just like Lindsay was saying, just play around,
Yeah, maybe it should be emotional.
Yeah. So I'm going to say another thing, right? Which is absolutely it is emotional. Like, so what Jordan was saying about him being really playful as a writer, right? Like, part of why I like this stuff so much is like this is literary writing. Like this is a different form of doing philosophy than the stuff that you're used to, and I think than probably the stuff that y'all are giving seminars on, right? And so I have a like long background in reading literature, and like that is useful here. Like that I'm thinking about translation and hey, what is this word? Like that's a literary background,
yeah,
right?
I saw you do
right?
That, yeah.
Like there's all kinds of things like that where like when I was making this connection to like this monstrosity thing that's happening at the end, and I'm like, oh, there's a monstrosity being born. Weren't we talking about incest earlier? Like there's a kind of narrative arc there that's happening, right? Where like that is like making this reference back to something. And so it isn't going to, I don't think this is going to, or I kind of hope it doesn't ever yield a like definitive idea of like what it is he's trying to say and what prescriptions he's making and stuff like that, right? Because to me, because it's about play in a lot of ways, right? Play is fun and is pleasurable, right? And so like to me there is a kind of pleasure in this text, like in dealing with it, in deciphering it, in trying to figure out what's going on and bringing my own stuff to it, like that process, like that performance, that interaction with his text, to me, that's something I think he wants you to get from this.
If I understand you correctly, if I were to give up on this fixation with trying to find the center and the origin, these dreams of deciphering or whatever, I would actually find this to be a very celebratory text, and I would enjoy it as you do by trying to make all these connections, playing with all the different languages.
Well, I mean, I don't know your life, but I have hopes for you. Yes.
Yeah, I think so. If that neurotic fixation were to fall away, that this wouldn't become such an onerous thing to read. It would actually be something more like reading Faulkner.
Yeah, I mean, there's a chicken egg issue here, right? Because like I think also what he's trying to do is get you to get rid of that, right? Yeah. He's trying with some like explanation and like, you know, particular terms and definitions and like this is inside and outside, the center's not the center, and he's explaining something. And then he's trying to get you to get rid of that.
Then just enjoy the signifiers, right? Like just to enjoy the sounds. And just for something to be beautiful, right? If the center falls away, you can just enjoy things.
Yeah. And so I do think that there's ways to have meaningful interactions and stuff like that. I don't think we're all just in the like world of like, you know, nothing can have meaning, and like they're just in the world of aesthetics or something like that. But that's not the right term. But I think like I do think that you're missing a whole way of engaging with this because you're fixated on one particular thing that you think philosophy is supposed to be doing, and many people do. It's reasonable.
It goes back to the part that resonated with me and CJ about how he talks about how Levi-Strauss got to that point where his structural anthropology did almost take on the form of a music concert. Mm-hmm. And if you can view the human sciences more like artistic performances, mm-hmm. and not be so obsessed with them being these grounding mm-hmm. loci of knowledge, like I think that's the shift that he's trying to encourage us to experience, mm-hmm. right?
Cool. Yeah.
Well, it almost sounds like if you're not so much analyzing the music as you are playing the music, as you are enjoying the language, as you are reading it mm-hmm. for the mm-hmm. pleasure of reading it. You know what I mean? And you're not going to, as you're reading it or as you're playing the music, you're not going to be like, what key were we in 3 measures ago? You're going to be like, I don't care. I'm just playing the violin, or, you know, that's my best violin impression. Mm-hmm, but, mm-hmm. yeah, so you're just going to be enjoying the text and reading it, and, you know, if it's paradoxical, it's okay. I mean, I don't know. Maybe to an Eastern mind, this would make more sense, or to in an Eastern philosophical lens where paradox is just the spice of life, this might make more sense. You know what I mean? Where we're just, like you said, like, paradigm. I mean, you're in Kierkegaard mode, man. You'd probably be like, this is fucking aesthetic stage. Like, where's God? Where's all of this stuff? You know what I mean? I mean, it almost seems nihilistic. I mean, totally.
But now, with this new perspective, I can say I enjoy it.
Yeah.
If I am seeing this perspective more clearly, now that I'm stepping back from the particularities of the text, and I am viewing it more in that performance, I'm like, I can get into this. I can dig this. I was like, no, maybe this is preparatory for me, and so that I can appreciate Ulysses more, and Faulkner more, and who's Pynchon, and Nabokov, and maybe this is so to make a whole world of literature that I was shut off to. Maybe it will now make it this thing that I lust for.
That's really
because all that literature was shut off to me because it didn't make sense. Right, but if I abandoned sense, so many things come into my life that are beautiful.
No, that's a great point, is that maybe a lot of the times when we try to disengage with something, we think that there's no reason behind it, or we say, what's the point? Was that even music? Is that art? We say these things that imply a center or a presence or an essence of something. And if we just throw those things aside, then maybe we can enjoy them. In some way, like you said, just enjoy the absurdity of what we thought, was absurd. We just say, I'll just take it all in. And maybe in coming to it on its own terms, you can enjoy it more, or maybe understand it in some way. So I think that's a great...
freeing to let go of the desire to make sense, or not desire, but to let go of the... what's the word? Like requirement to make sense of everything. The imperative to make sense of everything. And if you can like let that go, then I feel like a lot more like things can affect you differently, affect you differently. Like a lot more pleasure is like potentially available from aesthetic productions, from communication, from I don't know the world. So
well, I get on board with that.
Cool.
All right. So I'm going to bring it to a close unless anybody else has a parting conclusion. All right. That was a mixed bag. Pretty good. I'm feeling good about the Derrida there at the end. Okay. All right. Download the Noetic app. We'll have this up soon. Okay. Bye, guys.